Sometimes a man's deepest dream isn't about gold or glory, it's about finding someone who won't run when life gets hard. In the dust and fading light of the frontier, Wyatt Cain stands before his mail-order bride with a heart full of hope and hands that know only honest work. He tells June Mercy exactly what he wants, not a delicate flower, but a partner strong enough to build a legacy together. She came west, looking for a new beginning, but she never expected to find a man who sees strength in her that she's still learning to see in herself. What happens when two stubborn hearts decide to build something bigger than either of them ever dreamed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train's whistle echoed across the empty plains like a lonesome bird calling for its mate. June Mercy pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the endless expanse of grass and sky roll past in waves of gold and amber. 3 days of travel had brought her from the cobblestone streets of Boston to this vast wilderness, each mile taking her further from everything she'd ever known. In her carpet bag sat a worn leather Bible, its pages soft with age and handling. Between the pages of Psalms, pressed flowers from her mother's garden still held their faint perfume roses and lavender that seemed impossibly delicate now in this land of wind and dust. She'd carried that Bible through every uncertainty of her 27 years, through her father's death, through her mother's long illness, through the gradual realization that Boston held nothing for her but memories and empty rooms. The advertisement had been simple, practical. Rancher seeks wife for companionship and family. Must be strong, willing to work, and ready for frontier life. No delicate flowers need apply. She'd read it 3 times before setting down her teacup and reaching for paper and pen. Something in those words spoke to her, not the romance she'd once dreamed of, but the honest partnership she'd come to believe was more valuable than poetry. 50 miles west of Copper Bend, Wyatt Cain stood in his barn, running his hands along the smooth flanks of his favorite mare. The morning sun slanted through the gaps in the weathered boards, painting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor. His calloused fingers found a burr in the horse's mane, and he worked it free with patient gentleness that would have surprised most folks who knew him only as the giant who could wrestle a bull or split logs all day without breaking a sweat. At 35, Wyatt had built his ranch from nothing but stubborn will and back-breaking work. 500 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy house with room to grow, and barns that could weather any storm the territory threw at them. He'd carved it all from the wilderness with his own hands. But lately, the silence of the place had begun to weigh on him like a stone in his chest. Around his neck, hidden beneath his work shirt, hung a simple gold band on a leather cord, his father's wedding ring. The old man had worn it for 37 years, through drought and plenty, through the birth of 5 children and the building of a legacy that lasted long after he was laid to rest in the little cemetery on the hill. Wyatt touched it sometimes when the loneliness got too heavy, wondering if he'd ever have reason to slip it onto his own finger. The letter from June Mercy had arrived 3 weeks ago, written in careful script on good paper. She'd told him about her life in Boston, her work as a seamstress, her reasons for wanting a fresh start. What struck him wasn't what she said, but what she didn't say. No flowery declarations of love, no promises of domestic bliss. Just honest words from someone who understood that life was work, and work was better shared. "She'll do," he'd said to himself, and written back the same day. Now, as he hitched up the wagon for the trip to town, he found himself nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy. His hands, steady enough to thread a needle or deliver a calf, shook slightly as he adjusted the harness. He'd tucked a wildflower behind his ear that morning, small yellow bloom he'd found growing by the creek, though he couldn't say exactly why. It seemed foolish now, but something about the day called for a touch of beauty. Copper Bend wasn't much to look at, a main street lined with weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, and the small church where most folks gathered on Sundays. But it was home to good people who understood the value of hard work and neighborly kindness. Sarah Henderson, waved from her front porch as Wyatt's wagon rumbled past, her 3 children playing in the yard with the easy freedom of those who'd never known want or fear. "Morning, Wyatt," called Tom Bradley from outside his blacksmith shop. "Heard tell you're meeting the train today." Wyatt nodded, touching the brim of his hat. Word travelled fast in a small town, and his arrangements with June Mercy were hardly secret. He'd told the preacher to expect them, had even mentioned it to a few of the other ranchers. No point in being coy about practical matters. The train station was little more than a platform and a small building where tickets were sold and freight was sorted. Wyatt arrived an hour early, pacing the length of the platform like a caged wolf. He'd worn his best shirt and his newest boots, though both showed the honest wear of a working man. His dark hair was still damp from the washing he'd given it at the creek, and he'd trimmed his beard with more care than usual. When the train finally appeared on the horizon, trailing its plume of black smoke across the blue sky, Wyatt felt his heart hammer against his ribs. This was the moment that would change everything, or change nothing at all. He straightened his shoulders and planted his feet, ready to meet whatever fate stepped off that train. June emerged from the passenger car like a woman walking into a new world, which she supposed she was. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark traveling dress practical but well-made, her brown hair pinned up in a style that managed to look both proper and unassuming. She wasn't beautiful in the way men wrote songs about, but there was something in her eyes' steady strength that spoke of reserves untapped that made Wyatt catch his breath. Their eyes met across the platform, and for a moment neither moved. Then June stepped forward, extending her hand with the directness he'd hoped for. "Mr. Cain, I presume." "Miss Mercy." Her hand was firm in his, neither soft nor rough, but capable. "Welcome to Copper Bend." "Thank you." She looked around at the small collection of buildings, the vast sky overhead, the endless grass stretching to the horizon. "It's quite different from Boston." "Reckon it is." He gestured toward her traveling bag. "That all you brought?" "It's all I need." The simple statement told him everything he needed to know about her character. She hadn't come west expecting luxury or ease. She'd come prepared to build something new. The ride to his ranch passed in comfortable conversation. June asked practical questions about the land, the weather, the neighbors. Wyatt found himself relaxing, appreciating her straightforward manner and the way she really listened to his answers. When she commented on the beauty of the landscape, her voice held genuine appreciation, not the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to make the best of a bad situation. "It's harsh country," he told her honestly. "Winters can be brutal, summers dry as bone. Takes a certain kind of person to thrive out here." "I imagine it does," she replied, watching a hawk circle overhead. "But harsh doesn't mean without reward." By the time they reached his ranch, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. The house sat nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, surrounded by the outbuildings and corrals that made up his life's work. June surveyed it all with the eye of someone taking measure, not passing judgment. "It's exactly as you described," she said, and he heard approval in her voice. The preacher was waiting for them on the front porch, a small man with kind eyes and hands, soft from holding books instead of tools. Reverend Murphy had married half the couples in the territory, and he conducted their brief ceremony with dignity and warmth. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, just 2 people making a commitment under the vast Montana sky. When it came time for the vows, Wyatt looked into June's eyes and spoke from his heart. "I don't need a lady," he said, his voice carrying across the evening air. "I need a strong woman and 10 sons." June didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she smiled the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Then I suppose we understand each other, Mr. Cain." As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wyatt noticed the wildflower had fallen from behind his ear. June reached down and picked it up, examining it with gentle fingers before tucking it into her hair. It was a small gesture, but in it he saw the beginning of something that might, in time, grow into exactly what they both needed. Their first week as husband and wife passed in careful politeness, like two dancers learning each other's steps. June had taken to the morning chores with a determination that impressed Wyatt, though he noticed the way she gripped the milk pail too tight, her knuckles white with effort. She was trying hard, perhaps too hard, to prove herself worthy of his practical arrangement. The house felt different with her in it. Not just the obvious changes, the way she'd arranged wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table, or how she'd moved the chairs to catch the morning light, but something deeper. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed expectant, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see what would grow between them. June had discovered that frontier life demanded more strength than she'd anticipated. Her hands, soft from years of delicate needlework, now bore the honest marks of labor, small cuts from gathering firewood, calluses from helping with the animals, the permanent stain of earth under her fingernails. But she didn't complain. Instead, she studied Wyatt's methods with the focus of a scholar, learning the rhythm of his world so she could match it with her own. On the 7th morning of their marriage, Wyatt noticed the change in the air before he was fully awake. The quality of light filtering through the curtains was wrong, too grey, too heavy. He slipped from his bed in the small room off the kitchen, leaving June to her privacy in the main bedroom, and stepped onto the front porch. The sky hung low and threatening, the color of old pewter. To the north, a wall of darkness was building, moving toward them with the steady inevitability of fate. Wyatt had seen enough Montana weather to read the signs. This wasn't just a storm, this was the kind of blizzard that could bury a ranch and everything on it. "June," he called, stepping back inside to find her already dressed and stirring oatmeal at the stove. "We've got trouble coming." She looked up from her work, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only attention. "What kind of trouble?" "The worst kind this time of year. Blizzard moving in from the north, could last for days." He was already pulling on his heavy coat, his mind racing through everything that needed to be done. "The cattle in the north pasture need to be brought in. If we don't get them to shelter before this hits, we'll lose half the herd." June set down her wooden spoon and reached for her cloak. "What do you need me to do?" For a moment, Wyatt was struck speechless. He'd expected questions, maybe fear, certainly hesitation. Instead, she stood ready to face whatever came, her chin set with quiet determination. "It's dangerous work," he said. "Cattle get spooked in weather like this. They'll scatter, and in a blizzard." "Tell me what to do," she interrupted, and something in her voice reminded him of steel wrapped in velvet. They worked through the morning in a desperate race against time. June proved herself again and again, mounting Wyatt's gentle mare with surprising skill, helping to guide the frightened cattle toward the safety of the barn and shelter. Her eastern riding had taught her balance and confidence, and she adapted quickly to the rougher work of herding. The first snowflakes began to fall as they brought in the last of the stragglers, fat white flakes that seemed innocent enough until the wind picked up and turned them into stinging pellets of ice. Wyatt watched June coaxing a stubborn heifer toward the barn, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos around them, and felt something shift in his chest, loosening of the careful distance he'd maintained. By noon, the storm had arrived in earnest. Wind howled around the buildings like a living thing, and snow fell so thick they couldn't see the barn from the house. They'd managed to save the cattle, but the effort had cost them. June's clothes were soaked through, and Wyatt could see she was fighting exhaustion. "Get inside and get warm," he told her, having to shout over the wind. "I'll check the animals one more time." "I'll come with you," she called back. "No," his voice was firm. "You've done enough, more than enough." But when he emerged from the barn 20 minutes later, he found June waiting for him on the porch with hot coffee and dry clothes. She'd changed into a simple dress and had built up the fire until the house glowed with warmth. As he stomped the snow from his boots and stripped off his wet coat, he caught her studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was then that he noticed her gaze lingering on his chest, and he realized his shirt had come open during the struggle with the cattle. Around his neck, clearly visible against his skin, hung the leather cord that held his father's wedding ring. "I'm sorry," June said, looking away quickly. "I didn't mean to stare." Wyatt's hand went automatically to the ring, and for a moment he considered making up some excuse or changing the subject. Instead, he found himself pulling the cord over his head and holding the simple gold band in his palm. "It was my father's," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "He wore it for 37 years. My mother used to say it was the only piece of jewelry that ever mattered to him." June reached out tentatively, and when he nodded, she took the ring and examined it with gentle fingers. The gold was worn smooth in places, marked by decades of honest work and constant wear. "He must have loved her very much," she said softly. "They had 5 children together, built a life that lasted." Wyatt accepted the ring back and slipped the cord over his head again. "I always figured when I found the right woman, I'd have something worthy to give her, something that meant something." The confession hung between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared in their week of careful politeness. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the warm kitchen, they sat in a silence that felt different, not empty, but full of possibility. "Your hands," June said suddenly, and he looked down to see blood seeping through his shirt sleeve where a panicked cow had caught him with her horn. "It's nothing," he said, but June was already moving, fetching clean cloths and warm water. She worked with efficient gentleness, cleaning the wound and binding it with strips torn from what looked like a petticoat. "You'll need to be more careful," she said, but her voice was soft, almost tender. "I can't run this place by myself if you get yourself killed." He looked up at her, surprised by the admission. "You planning to stay then?" Their eyes met and held. "I don't run from storms, Mr. Cain. I've discovered I rather like the work." That evening, as the blizzard continued to rage outside, they sat by the fire sharing their first real meal as partners rather than strangers. June had managed to create something approaching a feast from their limited supplies, and Wyatt found himself talking more than he had in months about his plans for the ranch, his hopes for spring, the dreams he'd carried since his father's death. When June retired to her room that night, Wyatt remained by the dying fire, turning his father's ring between his fingers. For the first time since he'd placed the advertisement, he allowed himself to hope that what he'd found wasn't just a capable partner, but something far more precious. In her room, June sat on the edge of her bed, looking out at the storm through her small window. Her muscles ached from the day's work, but it was a good apathy kind that came from useful labor and worthy purpose. She thought about the moment she'd seen the ring around Wyatt's neck, the weight of meaning in that simple band of gold, and the way his voice had changed when he spoke of his parents' marriage. She'd come west, looking for a new beginning. What she hadn't expected was to find a man who carried his dreams so close to his heart, or to discover that her own heart might have room for dreams she'd never dared to name. The storm passed after 3 days, leaving the world transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine across the landscape, turning familiar landmarks into something magical and new. June stood at the kitchen window, watching Wyatt break trail to the barn, his tall figure dark against the white expanse. The sight stirred something in her chest that she was just beginning to recognize. Their partnership had deepened during those storm-bound days. Forced together by necessity, they'd fallen into rhythms that felt natural. June, tending the fire and preparing meals, while Wyatt saw to the animals, both of them working with the easy cooperation of people who understood the value of shared labor. This morning, June had made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her practical husband. While helping him carry feed to the barn, she'd climbed into the loft to retrieve another bale of hay. There, tucked into a corner behind stacks of supplies, sat a small wooden crib. It was beautifully made, carved from what looked like cherry wood and polished to a warm glow. The railings were turned with careful precision, and along the headboard, someone had carved a pattern of leaves and flowers with an artist's attention to detail. June ran her fingers along the smooth wood, seeing in every careful curve the hours of work, the hope, the dreams that had gone into its making. When Wyatt climbed up to see what was keeping her, he found June kneeling beside the crib, her sewing kit open beside her. The small wooden thimble that had belonged to her grandmother, her most treasured possession, sat on the floor where she'd set it while examining the crib. "You made this," she said, "and it wasn't a question." Wyatt's jaw tightened, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Seemed foolish to assume," he said, "but a man likes to be prepared." June stood slowly, brushing hay from her skirts. "When did you make it?" 2 years ago, maybe 3. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Had the wood, had the time. Figured someday." He stopped, shaking his head. "Like I said, seems foolish now." "It's beautiful," June said softly. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Something in her voice made him look at her then, and she saw surprise in his dark eyes. "It's just a crib." "No," June said, picking up her grandmother's thimble and closing her hand around it. "It's hope. It's faith in the future. It's the dreams of a man who believes in building something that will last." That afternoon, they carried the crib down from the loft and set it in the corner of the main bedroom. Neither spoke about why or what it might mean. But that evening, as they sat by the fire, June found herself stealing glances at the man across from her, seeing him with new eyes. "Tell me about your family," she said, setting down her mending. "Your parents, your brothers and sisters." Wyatt was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "My mother died when I was 15. Fever took her and my youngest sister the same winter. My father tried to keep us all together, but," he shrugged, "my brothers went their own ways. One went back east, one went to California. Haven't heard from either in years. And you stayed." "Someone had to. The land was good. The ranch was everything my father worked for. Seemed wrong to let it all go to waste." He looked into the fire. "Sometimes I wonder if I stayed for the right reasons, or if I was just too stubborn to leave." June set aside her sewing and moved to the chair beside his. "I think you stayed because you understand something that your brothers didn't. You understand that some things are worth preserving, even when it's hard." That night, for the first time since their marriage, they lingered at the table after dinner, talking about small things, the way the light fell across the mountains, the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, the satisfaction of work well done. June told him about her life in Boston, about the ladies she'd sewn for, and the small apartment where she'd lived alone for 3 years after her mother's death. "I was good at it," she said. "The sewing. I had steady customers, enough to keep myself comfortable. But comfortable isn't the same as happy." "What made you answer my advertisement?" Wyatt asked. June considered the question, wanting to give him an honest answer. "I was tired of living a life that felt borrowed. Everything I did, everywhere I went, I was just filling space that had been meant for someone else. When I read your letter, it sounded like you were offering something real, something that would be mine as much as yours. And now, how does it feel now that you're here?" June looked around the kitchen, at the crib visible through the bedroom doorway, at the man sitting across from her, with his rough hands wrapped around a coffee cup and his eyes gentle in the firelight. "Like coming home," she said simply. The next morning brought visitors. Sarah Henderson arrived, with her 3 children in tow, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth and wearing the expression of a woman on a mission. "June Cain," she said, marching up to the front porch like a general surveying territory. "I've come to welcome you properly to Copper Bend." June, who had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, wiped her hands on her apron and came around to greet her unexpected guests. Sarah was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Henderson," June said, remembering the woman from her brief glimpse of the town. "How thoughtful of you." "Sarah, please. We don't stand on ceremony out here." She gestured to her children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12. "These are my young ones, Tom, Billy and Mary. Children, say hello to Mrs. Cain." The children dutifully offered their greetings, but June could see their curiosity burning in their eyes. She suspected she was something of a novelty Eastern woman who'd married the solitary rancher. "I brought you some bread," Sarah continued, uncovering her basket to reveal not just bread, but also a jar of preserves, a wheel of cheese, and what looked like a rhubarb pie. "And I thought we might have a talk about how things work around here." They sat on the front porch while the children played in the yard, and Sarah proceeded to give June a thorough education in the social structure of Copper Bend. Who was related to whom, which families had been feuding for generations, who could be counted on in times of trouble, and who was best avoided altogether. "The thing you need to understand," Sarah said, cutting generous slices of pie for everyone, "is that out here we take care of our own. Doesn't matter if you're born here or if you came from the moon once, you're part of the community, your family." "And am I part of the community?" June asked. Sarah smiled. "Honey, the way you and Wyatt brought those cattle in during the storm, the way you worked alongside him like you'd been doing it all your life, you proved yourself in the best way possible." When Wyatt returned from checking the far pastures, he found June and the Henderson family gathered around his kitchen table, the children helping June roll out biscuits while Sarah told stories that made everyone laugh. For a moment, he stood in the doorway unnoticed, watching his wife with flour in her hair and joy on her face, surrounded by the warmth of community he'd almost forgotten was possible. "Wyatt Cain," Sarah called when she spotted him. "Get yourself in here and tell June about the time you tried to break that Mustang and ended up in Mrs. Patterson's flower garden." That evening, after the Hendersons had gone home with promises to return soon, June and Wyatt cleaned up the kitchen together. It was the first time their home had been filled with laughter and voices, and something about it felt right in a way that surprised them both. "They liked you," Wyatt said, hanging up the dish towel. "They liked us," June corrected. "Together. I think that matters more." Spring arrived in Copper Bend like a shy visitor, tentative at first, then bold with promise. The snow melted into rushing creeks, the grass turned green seemingly overnight, and the cottonwoods burst into leaf with an enthusiasm that made June laugh out loud the first time she saw them. She and Wyatt had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They rose before dawn to tend the animals, worked through the morning on the endless tasks that kept a ranch running, and spent their afternoons on the larger projects that would improve their land and their lives. It was during one of these afternoon work sessions that their relationship took another step towards something deeper than partnership. They were in the vegetable garden June had planned, preparing the soil for planting, when she paused in her digging to watch Wyatt work. He'd stripped off his shirt in the warm afternoon sun, and she found herself studying the play of muscle across his shoulders, the careful way he handled even the roughest tools, the concentration on his face as he worked. When he looked up and caught her staring, she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Something wrong?" he asked, straightening up and wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "No," she said quickly, then forced herself to be honest. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am." "Fortunate?" June leaned on her hoe, choosing her words carefully. "In Boston, the men I knew were all soft hands and softer principles. They talked about important things, but never actually did anything important. You're different." Wyatt moved closer, and she caught the scent of honest sweat and the soap he'd used that morning. "Different how?" "Your hands tell the story of your character," she said, reaching out to touch his calloused palm. "Every line, every skerrit's proof of work well done, of problems solved, of things built to last." He turned his hand to capture her fingers, and the simple touch sent warmth shooting up her arm. They stood like that for a long moment, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, the sound of bees working among the wildflowers, the only interruption to the silence. "June," he said, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "Yes? I need you to know that this isn't just convenience for me anymore. What we're building here," he gestured to encompass the garden, the ranch, the life they were creating together. "It's become something I didn't expect." "What did you expect?" "Partnership, mutual benefit, someone to share the work." His thumb traced across her knuckles. "I didn't expect to start caring whether you smiled when you looked at me. I didn't expect to lie awake wondering if you were happy." June felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "And are you disappointed?" "Disappointed?" Wyatt laughed, a sound that was equal parts amazement and relief. "June, I'm terrified. I've got no experience with this kind of caring. No idea how to be a husband to a woman who means something to me. She stepped closer, bringing her free hand up to rest against his chest. Maybe we can figure it out together. That evening, they sat on the front porch to watch the sunset, something that had become their custom. But tonight felt different. The careful politeness that had marked their early weeks together had given way to something warmer, more comfortable. When June shivered in the evening breeze, Wyatt didn't hesitate to pull his chair closer and wrap his arm around her shoulders. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, feeling her relax against his side. "I'm thinking about the future," June said, "about the children we might have, the family we might build. I'm thinking about how strange it is that 3 months ago, I didn't even know you existed, and now I can't imagine my life without you in it." Wyatt was quiet for so long that June began to worry she'd said too much, revealed too much of her heart too soon. But when she tilted her head to look at him, she saw not fear but wonder in his eyes. "I used to lie awake at night imagining conversations with a wife who didn't exist," he said. "Stupid things mostly. What she'd think of the sunrise, whether she'd like the way I arranged the furniture, if she'd want to change the color of the curtains. But I never imagined someone like you." "What do you mean?" "Someone who'd see the crib I made and understand what it meant. Someone who'd work beside me in a storm and never complain about getting dirty. Someone who'd make this place feel like home, just by being in it." They kissed for the first time as the last light faded from the western sky. It was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. When they broke apart, June rested her forehead against his and smiled. "I think we're going to be just fine," she whispered. The next morning brought a letter from town, actually several letters, all addressed to Mrs. June Cain in familiar handwriting. June's hands trembled slightly as she recognized her sister Margaret's script, and she set the letters aside while she finished her morning chores. When she finally sat down to read them, Wyatt had gone out to check the cattle, giving her privacy she hadn't asked for but was grateful to have. Margaret's first letter was full of news from home, which neighbors had married, who had died, what changes had come to their old neighborhood. But as June read on, the tone grew more concerned, more urgent. "Dearest June," the most recent letter began, "I have been thinking about your situation constantly, and I fear I must speak plainly. While I admire your courage in seeking a new life, I cannot help but worry that you have acted too hastily. Marriage to a stranger, life on the frontier, surely, these hardships are unnecessary when you have family who would welcome you home." June set the letter down, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Margaret continued with increasingly fervent pleas for June to return to Boston, painting pictures of the comfortable life that awaited her there, the security of familiar surroundings, the company of people who truly knew and loved her. "I have spoken with several respectable gentlemen who would be honored to court you properly," Margaret wrote. "Mr. Thornwell, the banker, has asked after you specifically. He remembers your fine needlework and your gentle manner, and I believe he would make you a most suitable husband. Please consider returning before you become too settled in that wild place. I fear the longer you stay, the more difficult it will be to readjust to civilized society." When Wyatt returned for lunch, he found June standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the mountains with an expression he couldn't read. The letters lay scattered across the table, and he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Bad news?" he asked carefully. June turned to face him, and he saw confusion in her eyes where there had been certainty that morning. "My sister wants me to come home." "Home to Boston?" "She says I've made a mistake, that this life is too hard, that I don't belong here. She's found a banker who's interested in courting me, someone suitable, she says. Someone who could give me the life I'm accustomed to." Wyatt felt his chest tighten, but he kept his voice level. "What do you think?" "I don't know," June said, and the uncertainty in her voice cut him deeper than any outright rejection could have. "Yesterday I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. Today—" She gestured helplessly at the letters, and Wyatt saw the battle being fought behind her eyes. The pull of the familiar against the promise of the unknown. The safety of convention against the risk of building something new. "I won't try to convince you to stay," he said quietly. "That has to be your choice. But I want you to know that if you decide to go, you'll be taking my heart with you." June looked up at him, startled by the raw honesty in his voice. Before she could respond, he had taken his hat from the peg by the door and was walking back outside, leaving her alone with her doubts and the weight of a decision that would change everything. The bundle of letters from Margaret sat on June's dresser like an accusation, their cream-colored envelopes seeming to multiply each time she looked at them. For 3 days, they had cast a shadow over the easy companionship she and Wyatt had built. Where once there had been comfortable conversation, now there were careful silences. Where once there had been shared glances and small touches, now there was a politeness that felt like walking on ice. June found herself studying everything with new eyes, trying to see it as Margaret would see it. The rough-hewn furniture that had seemed charmingly rustic now looked primitive. The endless chores that had felt purposeful now seemed like drudgery. The isolation that had promised peace now threatened loneliness. Wyatt, for his part, had retreated into the careful distance of their early days. He was unfailingly polite, considerate of her needs, but he no longer lingered over morning coffee or sought out her company during the long afternoon hours. June could feel him pulling away, protecting himself against the possibility of her leaving, and the distance between them grew wider each day. On the 4th morning after the letters arrived, June woke to find Wyatt already gone from the house. She dressed quickly and went to find him, following the sound of his axe to the woodlot behind the barn. He was splitting logs with the methodical fury of a man working through pain, his shirt already soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. "Wyatt," she called, but he didn't stop working. She moved closer, noting the set of his shoulders, the way he avoided looking at her directly. "We need to talk." "Nothing to talk about," he said, bringing the axe down with unnecessary force. "You'll do what you need to do." "And what if what I need to do is stay?" The axe paused mid-swing, and for a moment Wyatt stood frozen. Then he set the tool aside and finally looked at her. "Is that what you want?" June had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with that question, weighing the safety of her old life against the uncertainty of this new one. But looking at him now, this man who had given her honesty when he could have given her pretty lies, who had trusted her with his dreams and his fears, she felt the confusion of the past few days crystallize into clarity. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Wyatt's face went through a series of expression shock, disbelief, and finally, carefully guarded relief. "You're sure? Your sister made some compelling arguments." "My sister sees comfort and convention as the highest virtues," June replied. "She can't understand that I might want something more." "And what do you want?" June stepped closer, close enough to see the vulnerability he was trying to hide. "I want to build something that matters. I want to work beside someone who values my strength as much as my gentleness. I want to raise children who know the satisfaction of honest labor and the beauty of wild places." She reached up to touch his face. "I want to love and be loved by a man who keeps his promises even when they're hard to keep." The kiss that followed was different from their gentle first kiss on the porch. This one carried urgency, relief, and the weight of a choice made deliberately and with full knowledge of its consequences. When they broke apart, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers and let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "I thought I was going to lose you," he admitted. "You can't lose what was never really yours to begin with," June said. "But you can choose to build something together that belongs to both of us." That afternoon, June sat down to write her reply to Margaret. The letter was shorter than her sister's had been, but every word was chosen with care. "Dearest Margaret," she wrote, "I understand your concerns, and I appreciate the love that prompted them, but I must tell you that I have found exactly what I was looking for when I came west. I have found a man who values me for who I am, not who he thinks I should be. I have found work that gives my life meaning and a place where I belong. Most importantly, I have found a love that is built on respect and partnership rather than convenience and convention. I hope someday you will visit so you can see for yourself the life we are building here. Until then, please trust that I am exactly where I belong." She sealed the letter and set it aside to post the next time they went to town. Then she walked through the house, seeing it again, with eyes unclouded by doubt. The furniture was simple but well made. The view from every window was breathtaking. The silence was not empty but full of possibility. In the bedroom, she opened the trunk that held her few precious possessions and carefully lifted out her wedding dress. It was a simple gown of cream-colored silk, made for a ceremony that had never taken place back in Boston. She had brought it west without really knowing why, but now she understood. That evening, when Wyatt came in from his work, he found June waiting for him in the parlor, wearing the silk dress and with her hair arranged in soft curls around her face. She had lit every candle in the house, and the warm light made her skin glow like honey. "What's all this?" he asked, suddenly conscious of his work clothes and the smell of hay that clung to him. "This is our real wedding," June said, standing to face him. "The first one was practical, necessary. This one is because I choose you, Wyatt Cain. Not because I have to, but because I want to." She had prepared a simple meal, but they barely touched it. Instead, they talked through the evening about their hopes for the future, their plans for the ranch, the children they might have, and the legacy they wanted to leave. When Wyatt reached across the table to take her hand, she didn't hesitate to interlace their fingers. "I have something for you," he said, and she watched him reach into his vest pocket to pull out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside the cloth was a ring knot, his father's ring, which still hung around his neck, but a new one carved from a piece of cherry wood. It was simple but beautiful, polished to a warm glow, and sized to fit her finger perfectly. "I made it from the same wood as the crib," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "Seemed fitting somehow. It's not much." "It's perfect," June interrupted, holding up her hand to admire the way the wood caught the candlelight. "It's us." Later, as they sat together on the porch in the comfortable darkness, June rested her head against Wyatt's shoulder and felt the last of her doubts slip away. Margaret's letters had forced her to examine her choice, and that examination had only strengthened her certainty. "No regrets?" Wyatt asked, as if reading her thoughts. "None," June said firmly. "This is home. You are home." Above them, the stars wheeled across the vast Montana sky, bright and constant and infinite. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to build the life they both wanted. But tonight, they sat in perfect contentment, two people who had found in each other exactly what they'd been looking for all along. Summer arrived in earnest, painting the valley in shades of gold and green that took June's breath away each morning. The ranch thrived under their joint care, with the cattle growing fat on rich grass and the garden producing vegetables that would see them through the coming winter. But it was the discovery of Wyatt's journal that truly opened June's eyes to the depth of the man she had married. She found it by accident while cleaning the small room that served as his office. A leather-bound book had fallen from the shelf, spilling open to reveal pages covered with Wyatt's careful handwriting and detailed sketches. June knew she should close it immediately, respect his privacy, but the drawings caught her attention and held it. They were plans, dozens of them, drawn with the precision of an architect and the vision of an artist. Sketches of the house expanded to twice its current size, with a proper parlor and additional bedrooms. Detailed drawings of a new barn with stalls for horses and space for workshops, gardens laid out with mathematical precision, orchards planted in neat rows, a schoolhouse positioned to catch the morning light. But what struck her most were the smaller details scattered throughout the pages, a swing hanging from the old oak tree, children's toys drawn in the margins, a woman's silhouette standing in the garden, her face turned toward the mountains. Notes in the margins spoke of practical concerns, the cost of lumber, the best varieties of apple trees for the climate, the optimal placement of windows for cross-ventilation. One page was devoted entirely to a design for a workshop, complete with shelves for tools and a large table for projects. In the corner of that page, in smaller script, was written, "June's sewing room, good light, space for cutting table." storage for fabrics. The date at the top of the page was from before their marriage, before he had even received her first letter. June sank into the chair by the window, the journal heavy in her hands. Here was proof of something she had only begun to suspect, that Wyatt's vision of their life together went far beyond mere partnership. He had imagined her happiness, planned for her comfort, dreamed of their future, with a thoroughness that spoke of deep caring and careful hope. When Wyatt returned from town with supplies, he found June waiting for him on the front porch, the journal in her lap and tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't mean to pry. It fell open, and I couldn't help but look." Wyatt's face went through several expressions before settling on resignation. He climbed the porch steps slowly, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair. "Reckon a man's entitled to his dreams," he said quietly, "even foolish ones." "Foolish?" June stood, clutching the journal to her chest. "Wyatt, these aren't foolish dreams, they're beautiful dreams. They're the dreams of a man who believes in building something that will last." She opened the journal to the page with the sewing room. "You planned this before you even knew me, before you knew if I could sew or if I'd want such a space." "Seemed like something a woman might appreciate," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Space of her own, good light for fine work." "And this?" She turned to a page showing the expanded house, with a large kitchen and a dining room that could seat 12 people. "This is a home for a family, for a community. This is the vision of a man who understands what makes life worth living." Wyatt sat heavily in his chair, and June could see the vulnerability in his posture. "Started drawing those plans the winter after my father died. Long nights, nothing to do but think about what might be. Guess it became a habit." June moved to the chair beside his, the journal still open between them. "Show me more." For the next hour, Wyatt walked her through his drawings, explaining the reasoning behind each addition, each improvement. His voice grew more animated as he talked, and June saw glimpses of the artist hidden beneath the practical rancher. He had thought of everything: drainage for the expanded gardens, proper ventilation for the root cellar, even a small library with built-in shelves for books. "I know it's a lot," he said finally. "Maybe too much. Most of it would take years to build, maybe decades." "I don't see too much," June said softly. "I see a man who plans for the future because he believes the future is worth planning for. I see someone who thinks about other people's comfort and happiness, not just his own." She stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the land that stretched to the mountains. "In Boston, I knew men who talked about grand plans, but never lifted a finger to make them real. You're different. You think, you plan, and then you build." "Not all of it will happen," Wyatt said pragmatically. "Some of those ideas are just dreams." June turned back to him, and he saw determination in her eyes. "Then let's make them real. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Let's build the life you've been dreaming of." That evening, they spread the journal open on the kitchen table and began making more practical plans. Which improvements could be started this summer, which would wait until next year, how they might adjust the designs to make them more feasible. June contributed ideas that improved on Wyatt's original concepts, suggesting changes that would make the spaces more functional while maintaining their beauty. "We could start with the workshop," she said, tracing the drawing with her finger. "You need a proper space for carpentry, and I could use part of it for my sewing until we can build the addition to the house." "That makes sense," Wyatt agreed. "We've got the lumber, and the foundation work wouldn't be too complicated." As they talked, June found herself studying Wyatt's face, seeing him with new understanding. This was a man who carried beauty in his mind, who saw possibility where others might see only hard work and impossible dreams. The practical exterior she had fallen in love with hid an artist's soul and a romantic's heart. "There's something else," Wyatt said, turning to a page near the back of the journal. "Something I've been thinking about lately." The page showed a small building positioned near the creek with large windows and a bell tower. It was clearly a schoolhouse, complete with desks and a blackboard and bookshelves lining the walls. "For our children," he explained. and the other children in the valley. The nearest school is 20 miles away, too far for little ones to travel. But if we had our own, they could have an education without leaving home, June finished. Wyatt, this is wonderful. You're thinking about the whole community, not just our family. A place like this needs children to thrive, he said, and children need learning to make the most of their opportunities. June leaned over and kissed him, surprising them both with the sudden intensity of her emotion. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily despite being spoken for the first time. "I love your dreams, your vision, your generous heart. I love the way you think about the future as something to build rather than something to wait for." Wyatt's arms came around her, and she could feel the tension leave his body. "I love you too," he said quietly. "More than I thought possible, more than I knew how to say." They held each other in the lamplight, surrounded by the sketches and plans that represented their shared future. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch provided a gentle backdrop, cattle settling for sleep, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl. "We're going to build something remarkable," June said against his shoulder. "We already are," Wyatt replied, and June knew he was right. What they were building wasn't just a ranch or a house or even a family. They were building a love that could weather any storm, a partnership that made them both stronger, and a legacy that would outlast them both. The morning that would change everything began like any other. June was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Visitors were rare enough that she straightened up, shading her eyes against the autumn sun to get a better look at who might be coming to call. The wagon was unfamiliar, driven by a man in a city suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable on the rough ranch road. Beside him sat a woman whose bearing suggested she was accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. Even from a distance, June could see the expensive cut of her traveling dress and the way she held herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Wyatt emerged from the barn, and June saw him freeze when he caught sight of the approaching visitors. Something in his posture, a sudden tension, as if he were preparing for a blow, made her drop her basket and hurry toward the house. The wagon pulled up in front of the porch, just as June reached Wyatt's side. The woman stepped down with the man's assistance, and June got her first clear look at their unexpected guest. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair, arranged in elaborate curls, and green eyes that swept over the ranch with obvious distaste. Her dress was fashionable and costly, entirely unsuitable for frontier life, and she wore it with the air of someone making a statement. "Hello, Wyatt," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent and a tone of familiarity that made June's stomach clench. "You're looking well." "Victoria," Wyatt replied, and June heard a world of history in that single word. "What are you doing here?" The woman, Victoria, smiled, but there was something sharp in the expression. "Surely a wife has the right to visit her husband." The words hit June like a physical blow. Wife. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt the careful security of her world crack and begin to crumble. Beside her, Wyatt had gone rigid as stone. "You're not my wife," he said quietly, but Victoria's smile only widened. "I have papers that say otherwise." She gestured to the man in the suit, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Mr. Blackwood here is my attorney. Perhaps we could discuss this inside, away from prying eyes." June found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "I think any discussion should happen right here, where we can all hear it." Victoria's green eyes fixed on June for the first time, taking in her simple dress, her work-roughened hands, the dirt under her fingernails from the garden. "And you are?" "I'm June Cain," June said, lifting her chin, despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Wyatt's wife." "Oh, my dear," Victoria said, and her voice dripped with false sympathy. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding." The attorney, Blackwood, cleared his throat and opened his portfolio. "Mrs. Victoria Cain has legal documentation proving her marriage to Mr. Wyatt. Cain took place in New Orleans 7 years ago. The marriage was never dissolved." June felt the world tilt around her. 7 years. Before she had even known Wyatt existed, before she had even thought of leaving Boston, this woman had been his wife. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Victoria moved closer to Wyatt, and June noticed how familiar her movements seemed, as if she knew exactly how to position herself in relation to him. "Tell her, Wyatt. Tell her about New Orleans, about the riverboat wedding, about the promises you made to me." Wyatt's jaw worked silently for a long moment, and June watched his face with growing horror. She saw guilt there, and pain, and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. "I thought you were dead," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Dead? Oh, darling, I've been very much alive. Living quite well, actually, thanks to the generosity of certain gentlemen friends. But all good things must come to an end, and I find myself in need of the security that only a devoted husband can provide." "You left," Wyatt said, his voice growing stronger. "You took everything I had and disappeared in the night. I looked for you for months." "And I'm touched that you cared enough to search," Victoria said. "But here I am now, ready to resume my rightful place as your wife." June felt nauseous. The careful life she and Wyatt had built, the love they had discovered, the future they had planned, all of it was crumbling around her. If Victoria's claim was true, if she was legally Wyatt's wife, then June's marriage was a lie, her position here was false, and everything she had come to believe about her life was an illusion. "I want to see those documents," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Blackwood handed her a folder containing several official-looking papers. June's hands shook slightly as she examined them, but her mind remained clear. The marriage certificate looked legitimate, bearing the seal of New Orleans Parish and dated 7 years earlier. There were other documents as well: property records, bank statements, even what appeared to be a bill of sale for a riverboat. "These prove nothing," June said, though her heart was hammering. "Anyone can forge documents." "Careful, my dear," Victoria said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Accusations of forgery are serious matters. I would hate for this to become unpleasant." "More unpleasant than showing up uninvited to destroy people's lives?" June shot back. Victoria's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "I'm simply reclaiming what was always mine. The ranch, the land, the husband who made promises to me in better times." "The ranch is in my name," Wyatt said. "Has been since my father died." "But acquired during our marriage," Blackwood interjected smoothly, "which makes Mrs. Cain a legal partner in all marital assets." June looked at Wyatt, seeing the defeat beginning to creep into his posture. "You can't possibly believe this is legitimate." "It doesn't matter what I believe," Wyatt said heavily. "If the law says she's my wife, then she's my wife." "And that makes you what exactly?" Victoria asked June with false sweetness. "A mistress? A kept woman? How scandalous!" The insult hit its mark, but it also sparked something fierce in June's chest. She had not come this far, fought this hard, built this much, to be dismissed by a woman who had abandoned the man she now wanted to reclaim. "No," June said firmly. "I'm his wife. In every way that matters, I'm his wife, and I'm not going anywhere." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." As the confrontation continued, June noticed something that gave her hope. Wyatt might be resigned to legal defeat, but he was also watching Victoria with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust her. There was no warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, no recognition of the woman he had once loved. Whatever feelings he had once harbored for Victoria had died long ago. "I'll need time to review all of this," June said, closing the folder but keeping it firmly in her hands. "To consult with my own attorney." "Of course," Blackwood said, "but I should warn you that the law is quite clear in matters of prior marriage. Mrs. Cain has every right to remain here as the legal wife." "She can remain in town," Wyatt said suddenly. "There's a hotel. I'll pay for her lodging while this gets sorted out." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "How thoughtful. But I think I'd prefer to stay here, in my rightful home, with my husband." The word husband seemed to hit Wyatt like a physical blow, and June saw him flinch. But she also saw something else, flicker of the stubborn determination that had built this ranch from nothing. "We'll see what the law has to say about that," June said. As the strange party moved toward the house to continue their discussion, June caught Wyatt's arm and held him back for a moment. "I don't care what those papers say," she whispered fiercely. "I don't care what claims she makes. You're my husband, and I'm going to fight for what's ours." Wyatt looked down at her, and for the first time since Victoria's arrival, she saw hope flicker in his dark eyes. "Even if it means losing everything?" he asked. "Everything worth having is right here," June said, "and I'm not giving it up without a fight." The days following Victoria's arrival passed in a strange, tense choreography of avoidance and confrontation. She had indeed taken up residence in the house, claiming the guest room with an air of entitlement that made June's teeth ache. Wyatt had moved his belongings to the barn, sleeping in the tack room rather than share a roof with both women, and the arrangement satisfied no one. June threw herself into research with the desperate energy of someone fighting for her life. In her father's old law books volumes, she had inherited but never thought to use, she searched for precedents, loopholes, anything that might challenge Victoria's claim. The leather-bound texts were dense with legal language that made her head spin, but she persevered, making notes and cross-references with the methodical patience of a scholar. Late at night, by lamplight, she pored over the marriage documents Victoria had presented, studying every line and flourish for signs of forgery. Something about them nagged at her. They were too perfect, too pristine for papers that were supposedly 7 years old. But her untrained eye could find nothing definitively wrong. It was Sarah Henderson who provided the first ray of hope. She arrived on the third day after Victoria's arrival, ostensibly to check on June but clearly burning with curiosity about the strange situation that had the whole territory talking. "That woman," Sarah said without preamble, settling herself at June's kitchen table with the air of someone prepared for a long conversation. "Where exactly did she say she came from?" "New Orleans," June replied, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly from too little sleep and too much worry. "She claims she married Wyatt there 7 years ago." 7 years ago, Sarah mused, stirring sugar into her cup. "That would be 1868, wouldn't it? Right after the war ended." "Yes, I suppose it would be." Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. "Funny thing about New Orleans in 1868. My brother lived there then, working for the shipping company. The city was under military occupation, and record-keeping was chaos. Half the parish offices had been destroyed or abandoned, and the other half were run by carpetbaggers who couldn't tell a legal document from a grocery list." June felt her heart rate quicken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if someone wanted to create false documents from that time and place, it wouldn't be too difficult, especially if they had money to spend and weren't too particular about honesty." That afternoon, June sat down to write the most important letter of her life. She addressed it to Sarah's brother in New Orleans, asking him to investigate the records from the parish office to check for any irregularities in the documentation of marriages from 1868. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. Meanwhile, Victoria was making herself at home with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. She rearranged the furniture in the parlor, criticizing the rustic decorations and lamenting the lack of proper society. She complained about the food, the isolation, the primitive conditions, all while making it clear that she had every intention of staying and transforming the ranch to suit her more refined tastes. "Really, Wyatt," June heard her say as she passed the parlor window, "you've let this place become positively primitive. We'll need to modernize everything if we're going to entertain properly." Wyatt's response was too quiet to hear, but his tone suggested the conversation was not going well. June found herself torn between satisfaction at his obvious discomfort with Victoria's presence and fear that he might eventually give in to the legal pressure and accept the situation. It was on the fourth evening that June made a discovery that changed everything. She was returning Victoria's coffee cup to the kitchen when she noticed the woman's traveling bag sitting open on the guest room bed. Inside, visible among the silk undergarments and expensive toiletries, was a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. June knew she shouldn't look, knew that whatever she found might not be admissible in any legal proceeding. But desperation made her bold, and she quickly rifled through the correspondence. Most of the letters were unremarkable bills from dressmakers, invitations to social events, notes from friends. But near the bottom of the bundle, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a letter from Blackwood, the attorney, dated just 3 weeks earlier. "My dear Victoria," it read, "I have completed the documents as requested. The marriage certificate and supporting papers are quite convincing, though I must again express my reservations about this course of action. The penalties for fraud are severe, and if we are discovered..." The letter went on to discuss payment schedules and escape plans, making it clear that the entire scheme was an elaborate confidence game designed to defraud Wyatt of his property. Victoria had never been his wife. The documents were forged, the marriage was fictitious, and the whole elaborate charade was nothing more than theft dressed up in legal clothing. June's hands shook as she carefully returned the letters to their original position. She had found the proof she needed, but now she faced a new challenge: how to use it without revealing that she had searched Victoria's belongings. In a court of law, evidence obtained through theft might be worthless. She spent the rest of the evening in an agony of indecision, watching Victoria hold court in the parlor, discussing her plans for improving the ranch with the casual entitlement of someone who believed she had already won. Wyatt sat in silence, his face carved from stone, saying little and responding to Victoria's chatter with monosyllables. Finally, June could stand it no longer. She excused herself and stepped onto the front porch, needing air and space to think. To her surprise, Wyatt followed her out. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, settling beside her on the porch swing he had built just weeks earlier for their quiet evening conversations. "Maybe I have," June replied, then made a decision that could damn them both or set them free. "Wyatt, what if I told you I had proof that Victoria is lying? That the whole thing is a fraud?" His head turned sharply toward her. "What kind of proof?" June told him about the letter, about the clear evidence of conspiracy and forgery. She watched his face change as the implications sank in: hope warring with disbelief, anger battling with relief. "Where is this letter now?" he asked. "Still in her bag, and that's the problem. Even if we take it to the sheriff, it might not be admissible evidence. We need to find another way." They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them thinking furiously. Finally, Wyatt spoke. "What if we set a trap? What if we gave Victoria enough rope to hang herself?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we played along with her game but on our terms? Made her reveal the truth herself, in front of witnesses?" June felt a spark of hope. "That's dangerous. If it doesn't work..." "If it doesn't work, we're no worse off than we are now," Wyatt pointed out. "And if it does work, we get our life back." Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. It would require careful timing, trusted allies, and a healthy dose of luck. But it was their best chance, perhaps their only chance, to expose Victoria's fraud and reclaim their rightful place as husband and wife. "Are you sure about this?" June asked as they finalized the details. "There's still time to try the legal route, to hope that my letter to New Orleans bears fruit." Wyatt took her hands in his, and she saw the determination that had built this ranch from nothing burning in his dark eyes. "I'm sure," he said. "We're going to fight for what's ours, and we're going to win." The next morning, June began putting their plan into motion. It would take several days to arrange all the pieces, to get the right people in the right places at the right time. But for the first time since Victoria's arrival, June felt hope blooming in her chest. They were going to expose the lie, reclaim their marriage, and send Victoria packing. And if everything went according to plan, they would do it in a way that would ensure she could never threaten them again. The game was about to begin in earnest, and June was ready to play for keeps. The confrontation June and Wyatt had planned took place in the town hall on a crisp October morning, with half of Copper Bend in attendance. Word had spread quickly through the small community that the Cain marriage dispute would be settled once and for all, and curiosity had drawn nearly everyone within riding distance. Judge Morrison had ridden in from the territorial capital specifically for the hearing, a stern man with silver hair and the kind of piercing gaze that suggested he had little patience for nonsense. The town's official marriage register lay open on the table before him, its pages chronicling the unions that had built the community. Victoria sat at the front of the room with Blackwood, her attorney, looking every inch the wronged wife in a dress of deep blue silk that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. She had spent the morning accepting sympathetic looks from those who believed her story, playing her part with consummate skill. June and Wyatt sat across from them, and June could feel the weight of the community's attention pressing down on her shoulders. Some faces showed support, others skepticism, and still others mere curiosity about how the drama would unfold. "This hearing," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room, "has been called to determine the validity of competing marriage claims. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, formerly Cain, asserts that her marriage to Mr. Wyatt Cain 7 years ago in New Orleans was never legally dissolved, making his subsequent marriage to Miss June Mercy invalid." June's heart clenched at hearing herself referred to as Miss Mercy, as if her months as Mrs. Cain had been nothing more than an elaborate pretense. "Mrs. Blackwood," the judge continued, "please present your evidence." Victoria rose gracefully, her performance flawless as she handed over the documents that had thrown June's world into chaos. "Your Honor, I present the official marriage certificate from St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, dated October 15th, 1868, along with supporting documentation proving my identity and the validity of the union." Judge Morrison examined the papers with the thoroughness of a man who had seen every kind of legal fraud imaginable. June held her breath, watching his face for any sign that he detected the forgery she was certain existed. "These appear to be in order," he said finally, and June felt her heart sink. "Mr. Cain, do you dispute the validity of this marriage?" Wyatt stood slowly, and June could see the tension in every line of his body. This was the moment they had planned for, the opening move in their desperate gambit. "Your Honor," Wyatt said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "I do not dispute that I knew this woman in New Orleans, but I categorically deny that we were ever legally married." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Victoria's face showed just a flicker of uncertainty before her mask of injured dignity slipped back into place. "Furthermore," Wyatt continued, "I believe these documents are forgeries, created for the purpose of defrauding me of my property and destroying my legal marriage to June Mercy Cain." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Cain," Judge Morrison said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" This was the crucial moment. June rose from her seat, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "Your Honor, I would like to present evidence that calls Mrs. Blackwood's claims into question." She had spent the previous week preparing for this moment, gathering not just the evidence she had discovered in Victoria's letters, but building a comprehensive case that would expose the fraud from multiple angles. "First," June said, producing a letter from her reticule, "I have here correspondence from the parish office in New Orleans, confirming that no marriage between Wyatt Cain and Victoria Beaumont took place on October 15th, 1868, or any other date in that year." The letter had arrived just 2 days earlier, sent by Sarah's brother after his investigation into the parish records. It was brief but devastating. No record of marriage between named parties. Parish office destroyed by fire in 1869, but surviving records show no such union. Victoria's face went pale, but Blackwood was quick to respond. "Objection, Your Honor. Record-keeping was notoriously poor during the Reconstruction period. The absence of records proves nothing." "Perhaps not," June agreed, "but this might." She produced a second document, this one bearing the seal of a New Orleans bank. This is a record of financial transactions showing that Victoria Beaumont was married to one Charles Blackwood on September 3rd, 1868, more than a month before her alleged marriage to my husband. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Victoria's attorney wasn't just her legal counsel, he was her husband, making their entire scheme a conspiracy between spouses to defraud an honest man. "That's preposterous," Victoria exclaimed, rising from her seat with more emotion than she had shown since arriving in Copper Bend. "I have never been married to anyone but Wyatt." "Haven't you?" June asked quietly. "Then perhaps you can explain this." She produced the most damning piece of evidence, a copy of Victoria's marriage certificate to Charles Blackwood, obtained through the same New Orleans investigation that had disproven her claims about Wyatt. Judge Morrison examined the document with growing interest. "Mrs. Blackwood, this appears to be your signature, and Mr. Blackwood, this appears to be yours as well. Are you telling this court that you are not in fact married to each other?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Victoria and her supposed attorney exchanged glances, and June could see the moment when they realized their carefully constructed lie was crumbling around them. Victoria began, then stopped, clearly calculating whether the truth or another lie would serve her better. It was Blackwood who broke first. "Your Honor, I invoke spousal privilege and refuse to answer any questions that might incriminate my wife." The admission was as good as a confession. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd, and Judge Morrison's face darkened with anger. "So you admit that you are married to each other?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Which means that Mrs. Blackwood's claim to be the legal wife of Mr. Cain is not just false, it's fraudulent." Victoria made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "The dates could be wrong. Records from that time were confused, incomplete." "Enough," Judge Morrison said firmly. "I've heard sufficient evidence to conclude that this entire proceeding has been based on fraudulent documents and false testimony." Judge Morrison's expression was thunderous as he surveyed the courtroom, his gaze settling on the two conspirators who had attempted to make a mockery of his court. The silence that followed his pronouncement was so complete that June could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. "Sheriff Bradley," the judge said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, "arrest both Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft through false documentation." Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, her refined accent slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "You can't simply dismiss legal documents because they're inconvenient." "Madam," Judge Morrison replied coldly, "what I cannot do is allow my court to be used as a stage for criminal theater. The evidence presented makes it clear that you and your husband have engaged in an elaborate fraud designed to steal an honest man's property." As Sheriff Bradley and his deputies moved forward with shackles, Victoria made one last desperate appeal. "Wyatt, surely you remember our time together in New Orleans. Surely some part of you—" "I remember a young woman who took what little money I had and disappeared in the night," Wyatt said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I remember spending months looking for someone who didn't want to be found. But I never married you, Victoria. Whatever we had, it wasn't a marriage." The finality in his voice seemed to break Victoria's last hope. She allowed herself to be led away, though she continued to protest her innocence even as the courthouse doors closed behind her. Judge Morrison turned his attention to the official marriage register that lay open on the table before him. "Now then," he said, his tone warming considerably, "let us address the matter of the legitimate union before us." He dipped his pen in ink and wrote carefully in the register's margin, "Let the record show that the marriage between Wyatt Cain and June Mercy Cain, performed by Reverend Murphy on May 15th of this year, is legally valid and remains in full force. Furthermore, any challenges to this union based on the fraudulent documents presented today are hereby dismissed." June felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as the judge prepared an official document bearing the territorial seal. But it was his next action that truly moved her. "Mrs. Cain," Judge Morrison said, "you mentioned during the proceedings that you wished to have your partnership formally recognized in the property records. Is that still your desire?" "Yes, Your Honor," June replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The judge prepared a new deed, his pen scratching across the official paper with deliberate care. "Let it be recorded that the Cain Ranch property, previously held solely in the name of Wyatt Cain, is hereby documented as joint ownership between Wyatt Cain and June Cain, reflecting their equal partnership in both marriage and enterprise." He signed the document with a flourish and pressed his official seal into the warm wax. This deed represents not just legal recognition, but acknowledgement of what anyone with eyes can see, that you have built something together that is stronger than either of you could have created alone. As the crowd began to stir and the formal proceedings concluded, neighbors and friends pressed forward to offer their congratulations. Sarah Henderson was among the first to reach them, her face bright with tears of joy. "I knew that Painted Woman was nothing but trouble," Sarah declared, embracing June warmly. "Real marriage isn't about fancy papers and legal tricks. It's about standing together when the storms come, and you two have proven that beyond any doubt." Tom Bradley pumped Wyatt's hand with enthusiasm. "Never seen a fraud exposed so thoroughly," he said with satisfaction. "That woman picked the wrong couple to swindle. The whole territory knows you and June belong together." Reverend Murphy approached with quiet dignity, his weathered face creased in a gentle smile. "I'm grateful to see justice done," he said simply. "The union I blessed was made in good faith and honest love. No amount of legal trickery could have changed that truth." As the crowd gradually dispersed, June and Wyatt found themselves alone on the courthouse steps, holding the precious documents that confirmed what their hearts had always known. The new deed was smooth in June's hands, but it was the sight of both their names written together in official script that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "It's over," she whispered, and the words came out like a prayer of thanksgiving. "It's over," Wyatt agreed, pulling her into his arms right there on the courthouse steps, uncaring of who might see. "We're free, June. Free and clear and legal in every way that matters." The ride home passed in companionable silence, both of them processing the emotional upheaval of the day. The familiar sights of their land seemed more precious now for having been threatened, and when they crested the hill that offered their first view of home, June felt her heart swell with gratitude. That evening, they built a fire in their hearth and fed Victoria's forged documents to the flames, watching the lies turn to ash and smoke. As the last paper curled and blackened, Wyatt reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something that made June's breath catch. His father's wedding ring gleamed in the firelight, the simple gold band worn smooth by decades of faithful wear. He held it reverently, and June could see the weight of memory and meaning in his careful touch. "I've carried this for 15 years, he said quietly, waiting for the right moment, the right woman, the right life to give it meaning again." He looked at her, and she saw all their shared struggles and triumphs reflected in his dark eyes. "I believe that moment has come." June held out her left hand, where the wooden ring he had carved for her still circled her finger. The simple band had been with her through every challenge, every doubt, every moment of joy they had shared. "Are you asking me to marry you again, Mr. Cain?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm asking you to wear my father's ring beside the one I made with my own hands," Wyatt said, slipping the gold band over her wooden one. "I'm asking you to help me honor the past while we build our future. I'm asking you to be my wife in every way legal, spiritual, and eternal." The two rings nestled together perfectly, as if they had been crafted as a pair. June held up her hand, marveling at how the firelight caught both bandsewn representing the love they had discovered, the other representing the legacy they would continue. "Yes to all of it," she said simply. "Yes to the past and the future and everything in between. Yes to whatever comes next, as long as we face it together." They sealed their renewed vows with a kiss that tasted of victory and promise, surrounded by the warmth of their home and the certainty that what they had built was strong enough to weather any storm that might come their way. 2 years later, June stood in the doorway of their expanded house, watching Wyatt carve tiny wooden boots by the light of the oil lamp. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly, where their first child grew strong and sure, due to arrive with the spring thaw. The baby boots he was crafting were no larger than her thumb, but they represented a hope that had finally become reality. The ranch had prospered beyond even Wyatt's optimistic dreams. The new barn stood completed, its red paint bright against the winter snow. The workshop they had built together housed not only Wyatt's carpentry tools, but also June's expanding seamstress business. As more families settled in the valley, and her reputation for fine work spread throughout the territory. Inside the house, the changes were even more remarkable. The parlor had been expanded to accommodate the growing number of visitors who came calling, drawn by June's warm hospitality and Wyatt's reputation as a fair and generous neighbor. The kitchen now boasted a proper stove and enough space for June to prepare meals for the dozen people who regularly gathered around their table on Sundays. But the most significant change was the small room off the main bedroom, painted a cheerful yellow and furnished with the cherry wood crib that had waited so patiently for its purpose. Soon, very soon, that room would hear the cry of a Cain baby, the first of what they hoped would be many children to fill their home with laughter and love. "You're supposed to be resting," Wyatt said without looking up from his carving, though June could hear the smile in his voice. "I'm watching my husband prepare for our baby," June replied, settling into the chair beside him with the careful movements of a woman in her 8th month. "That hardly counts as work." Wyatt set down his knife and reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers so that both rings, the wooden one he had carved and the gold one that had belonged to his father, caught the lamplight. "Are you nervous? About the baby?" June considered the question seriously. "No, not nervous exactly. Eager, perhaps, ready to meet this little person we've created." "And about being a mother?" June smiled, thinking of all the ways her life had changed since that first evening when she'd stepped off the train in Copper Bend. "I think about the woman I was then, so afraid of making the wrong choice, so worried about whether I belonged here. Now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." The community that had welcomed her so readily had grown as well. 3 more families had settled in the valley, drawn by the promise of good land and good neighbors. The schoolhouse from Wyatt's journal drawings was no longer just a dream construction, would begin as soon as the ground thawed, funded by contributions from every family in the area and built with volunteer labor. Sarah Henderson's youngest daughter would be the first teacher, a bright girl of 17, who had received her education back east and was eager to return home to serve her community. The thought of their own children learning to read and write in that little building, surrounded by the children of their neighbors, filled June with quiet satisfaction. "I had a letter from Margaret yesterday," June said, pulling the envelope from her sewing basket. "She's finally agreed to visit this summer." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "After 2 years of telling you what a terrible mistake you've made." "I think the photograph we sent changed her mind." June smiled, remembering her sister's shocked response to the image of June and Wyatt standing in front of their completed house, surrounded by the evidence of their prosperity and clearly radiating happiness. She wrote that I look remarkably well for someone living such a primitive life. And what did you write back? That love and honest work are better beauty treatments than any powder or paint. June shifted in her chair, accommodating the baby's restless movements. I also told her that we have indoor plumbing now and glass windows, so she needn't worry about being too uncomfortable during her visit. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside and the soft sounds of the house settling around them. These quiet evening hours had become precious to them, stolen moments of peace before the demands of parenthood would claim their attention. The cherrywood crib caught June's eye, and she thought about all the dreams that had led to this moment. Wyatt's patient hope, carved into wood and stored in a barn loft. Her own courage in leaving everything familiar to build something new. the love that had grown between them, tested by adversity and proven strong enough to weather any storm. "Do you ever think about where we might have been if I hadn't answered your advertisement?" she asked. Wyatt considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I think you would have found your way to happiness eventually," he said. "You're too strong, too determined to settle for less than what you deserve. And you? I might have spent the rest of my life carving baby toys for children who never came, building rooms for a family that never filled them." He looked up at her, and she saw the deep contentment in his dark eyes. "I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to take the chance." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick. June gasped and pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the strong little feet pushing against her ribs. "Someone's ready to make an appearance," she said, laughing despite the discomfort. Wyatt set aside his carving and knelt beside her chair, placing his large hands over hers. "Soon," he said softly, "very soon we'll meet this little person who's already making their presence known." The baby settled at the sound of his voice, as if recognizing the man who would be its father. June marveled again at the wonder of it all, how two strangers had found each other across the vastness of the frontier, how their practical arrangement had blossomed into a love deeper than either had dared to imagine. "We did it," she said quietly. "We built exactly what we set out to build." "We built more than we set out to build," Wyatt corrected. "We built something extraordinary." Outside, the first storm of winter was gathering strength, but inside their sturdy house, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the promise of tomorrow, Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt Cain settled in for the night. Soon their family would grow by one, and in time, perhaps it would grow by many more. But whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced everything else together, with honest work and stubborn love, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth building, no matter how difficult the construction might be. The tiny wooden boots sat finished on the table, waiting for the small feet that would soon fill them. Like everything else in their life, they had been made with care, crafted to last, and infused with the kind of hope that builds legacies and changes the world, one small step at a time.